You, mate. I'm really looking forward to this. And like I said to you before the tour, it's another reserve at the 35 we've got. I haven't been to again, so I need to get out more, don't I, really?
Right. Cheers, Mark.
No
And
worries,
thanks
mate.
everyone for joining us tonight. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the work I've been doing out at Cors-y-Sarnau for the last couple of years. And before I forget, and before I get any further, I just need to say thanks to Natural Resource Wales and Interreg Northwest Europe, who've been funding this project and the work that we're doing out there. So for those of you who don't know, and by the sounds of this this includes Mark, Cors-y-Sarnau is actually one of the reserves that North Wales Wildlife Trust has been managing the longest. We've been managing the site since 1972, took full ownership in 1991. And it's a really interesting reserve. It's one of our furthest south, out near Bala. And originally it was just a 15-hectare site, most of which is classed as a site of special scientific interest. And back in 2014, we added another 15 hectares to the site by purchasing a bit of land. So what I'm going to do is just have a little walk through the original part of the reserve. And then for the rest of the talk, I'm going to focus on the new extension, which is where we've been focusing on the restoration works. So, like I say, it's a really interesting site, Cors-y-Sarnau. Basically, it represents the transition from a post-glacial lake that's basically filled up over time into a series of different bogs, mires. And the reason why it was designated as a SSSI is for two of the features. One of them is a mosaic of fen, mire, marshes, swamps. And the other one, which takes up most of the site, was a wet woodland or an alder. These are fantastic habitats. Between them, we've got over 100 different types of mosses recorded. The woodland is home to 3, I think it is, nationally scarce crane flies, and several other species that are regionally and locally important. There's a whole host of records of different types of invertebrates there. And it's also home to a whole range of different birds, particularly little warblers, grasshopper warblers, willow warblers, that we hear a lot when we're walking through the woods, but very rarely see. So what would you expect to see when you go there? Well, like I say, most of the site is wet woodland, and this is amazing. Everyone who goes there describes it as magical. Basically, it's a peatland. There's about 1 to 2 meters of peat under there. Anecdotally, I've heard it's more. A neighbour tells us he once lost a shire horse in there. Not entirely sure I believe him on that, but I've definitely been in it over my waist, so I know there's a fair amount of peat there. But unlike many woodlands that you see, it really is absolutely saturated. So rather than your typical woodland understory, what you've got is these great big mounds and carpets of mosses and other wetland plants. So rushes, bilberry, bog bean, marsh cinquefoil. And it's a really stunning site. It changes constantly throughout the year. And it's just one of those places you've got to go to it all through the year just to experience it and see all the different colours. And one of the other things is it is an ancient woodland, and there are some absolutely amazing lichens there. So if you ever find yourselves down there, please go for a stroll in the woods. You won't see anything else like it on any of our other reserves. And then the other feature of this SSSI is all these different mires and marshes. Now, these aren't very photogenic. So they're going to look pretty similar on here. But what they've got is a real mixture of tussocky grasses, little heathers, bilberries, and in between them, lots of more interesting shorter vegetation, so short sedges, sphagnum mosses, and all sorts of other wetland plants. So again, that's one of the really valuable things here, is just this diversity of different habitats and the sheer amount of flora that are there. So here's just a few of the more photogenic examples. We do get a few orchids, marsh orchids and heath orchids pop up from time to time. Ragged robin is one of my favourite. It always looks stunning out on the edge of the marshes. Over on the right-hand side, little bottle sedges. Again, if you can find those between the tussocks, they're really amazing little plants. And then one of my favourites is the insectivorous sundews, which are a bit of a symbol for Cors-y-Sarnau because they're on a reserve sign there. But unfortunately, we think they're in a bit of a decline. We've not really got any good records of them for the last couple of years. So that's one we're constantly keeping an eye out for. But as you can see, the original reserve, it's just such an amazing, varied habitat. And there's lots to see and do there. So that begs the question of why did we want to buy this land next to it? So it's called Coed, and it was 15 hectares of Sitka spruce, slap bang right to the side of the reserve. And it really does beg the question, why was North Wales Wildlife Trust interested in this conifer plantation when we'd already got a really amazing reserve there? And it basically came down to a few signs that there was actually a bit of a wetland habitat there. When we had a look at it, there were a few wetland plants hanging on underneath the conifers, and there was peat. In fact, some of the peat measurements are up to 6 meters, which is a really phenomenal depth of peat. So that sort of got an idea going, well, can we do anything with it? Can we return it from a conifer plantation back into a wetland? And the other thing that appeals here is it's a continuation of the existing Cors-y-Sarnau wetland. So we're not just tacking a little bit of woodland on, we're actually looking to expand and improve those habitats that are already there and already quite special. And this is what it looked like in 2014 when we purchased it. Basically, it was a dense Sitka plantation. All these conifers tightly packed together, very little in the way of ground plants. And what little wetland vegetation was hanging on was in these little ditches that were being used for drainage. Now, I can't take credit for the title of this talk, but I think it's really apt that basically what we're looking at is a sort of very monotone Sitka plantation. And if we're trying to restore it to wetland, we're hoping to get something a lot more diverse, a lot more colourful, with a lot more going on there. So the first thing that we did with the reserve back in 2016 was we cleared the Sitka. And one of the things we had to be very mindful of was these specialist wetland areas where we thought the deepest peat was. So a lot of it was cleared by machinery, but in the end, some of it was cleared by hand, where we thought that basically the peatland would be too destroyed by trying to take machinery on. What we ended up with is this. Basically, all the conifers were stripped off it, and it just left this very furrowed topography with ditches and grips in it. And a lot of the brash was then piled up back into the ditches in a sort of a vague attempt to level out the surface and hold back some water in the ditches as well. So it's already looking a little bit more colourful, but it's not great. One thing you can see on there is on the right-hand side, there's one of the ridges where the conifers were growing. And then off to the left, there's a little furrow, and you can actually see some of the sphagnum, some of the bog mosses that were there. And that's one of the things that really attracted us to this site, is knowing that even though there'd been conifer on there for many, many years, that the wetland plants were still hanging on. So the big question is, what next? Well, the honest answer was not a lot. The site has been purchased in 2014, cleared in 2016, and then there was very little we could actually do with it. It's a really big job we're looking at to try and do any wetland restoration on here. And then in 2021, we were invited to join Peat, which is an Interreg Northwest Europe project. And the project was all about restoring peatland sites across Northwest Europe and at the same time, looking at how that's affecting their carbon storage capacity. So from an initial project of 9 partners, we came on as a late partner. And Cors-y-Sarnau was chosen because of the amount of peat there, the potential for restoration, and the fact it was quite a different site to some of the other peatlands that people have been dealing with. A lot of the sites in Europe were low-lying, that had been sites that had been heavily extracted for peat. Whereas what we've got was somewhat different, a conifer plantation with some of the wetland species still there. The big benefit of us joining CarePeat, aside from some funding to help us with the project, is that we've been able to work with our project partners from various different conservation organisations and universities across Northwest Europe to help us get the knowledge that we need to understand how we're going to restore our site and make those right connections to be able to talk to people who really understand what makes a successful peatland restoration project. So, as Mark already said, my actual job title is Peat Project Officer. As you can imagine, I worry about peat a lot. And one of the questions I get all the time is, what is actually peat? Why are we interested in it? So I'm just going to take a little interlude here before we get back to Cors-y-Sarnau. Peat basically it's an organic rich soil that's created when plant material builds up without decaying. And the usual reason for that is because it's waterlogged. What makes peat so special is that because the plants aren't decaying, they're not releasing carbon dioxide and methane. And as peat builds up, that carbon gets locked up inside the peat. In fact, if you leave it long enough, a few million years, bake it a bit, it turns into coal. So that just gives you an idea of just how much carbon peat has in it. But the flip side of that is that if peat is degraded, if it starts to dry out, so if it's extracted or if it's burned or if it's drained, then those decay processes start to kick in and the peat actually starts emitting carbon. The other thing about peat is it's very slow to form. It basically builds up about 1 millimetre a year. So it's not a particularly sustainable resource. So if people extract it, then it takes a long, long time to build that back up. And when we're talking about peat, we're often thinking about bog mosses and sphagnum. They're not the only plant that forms peat, but they are one of the most prolific. And that's because of a couple of properties they've got. The first one is they really, really like to hold on to water. They basically act like a sponge, and they have a great capacity for sucking up a great volume of water and holding on to it as long as they can. And that's one of the factors that really helps them make peat. The other one is that sphagnum is actually slightly antimicrobial, so that also inhibits decay. So most of the best peatlands are sphagnum rich. And then that leads on to another question that I get all the time when I'm talking about restoration projects like this one. If we're trying to save carbon, why are we cutting down trees? And it's a really valid point because we all know trees lock up carbon. Well, the counter argument is that technically peatland does it better. One of the problems with woodlands is that there's usually a rapid uptake of carbon at the start as the trees are establishing, but that starts to tail off. And then the other question is what's happening to the trees? Are they being felled and taken off for uses because there's probably going to be carbon loss there? Or just through natural decay processes, if wood's left standing, carbon will be released. Whereas, as I mentioned earlier, with peat, once it's in the ground, if it doesn't get disturbed, that's it, it will lock the carbon up. That isn't to say, however, we should be cutting down every woodland and replacing it with peat. It's a balancing act, really, between what's going to be the best solution. And we wouldn't advocate cutting down a wood and trying to flood it. But where we've already got a site that used to be a wetland and there is peat there, that's where we'd be looking at potentially doing a peatland restoration project and also reaping some benefits from carbon storage. So back to Coed-y-Sarnau, one of the really important questions that we had to ask is, what are we doing with this? Where are we starting from? So we've felled all the trees, but what next? We've got a really uneven, mixed surface. And that's not where a lot of peatland restoration projects start from. A lot of them have got ground that's been heavily modified and extracted, and a lot of the wetland plants have been lost. And effectively, it's a blank slate for them to carry out the restoration. And there was a really strong argument for us doing it here. If we level the site, clear everything off, we've basically got a blank canvas. Now, that would be phenomenally expensive, but it would mean that we'd probably get quite quick results and be able to focus it straight away on, we want this to be a sphagnum bog. And this is something we went backwards and forwards on a few times, just how much do we need to intervene with our restoration project? And the conclusion we came to was that, well, it would be such a shame that all those wetland plants have hung on so long underneath a conifer plantation for us to just wipe them off and start again. And that leads on to another question we had to ask. What are we actually trying to achieve? Is our goal here to just restore as much peatland as we can across the site at the expense of anything else? Just say, we've got 15 hectares here, we want 15 hectares of peatland. Or are we trying to think about the biodiversity? Well, with wildlife trusts. So obviously biodiversity is high up on our list there. So again, what we decided in the end is maybe we need a softer touch. We start with the minimum intervention we can, and then let nature take its course and see what we get. We don't necessarily have to have something set in stone of this is what a bog should look like, or this is the amount of carbon that we need to store. Basically, we came up with this sort of plan. Where the peat's deepest, where those wetland plants are more common, we'd look at restoring those to wetland areas. Down in the south of Coed-y-Sarnau, it was looking really poor for restoration. It's a steep slope. There wasn't a lot of peat there. The amount of effort we would need to put in there to restore it to a wetland would have been phenomenal, and we wouldn't really achieve a lot. So we decided there, actually, we'll just let it naturally regenerate into deciduous woodland. And in fact, that will make a really nice contrast to the wet woodland that's at the bottom of the slope. So we're creating a new habitat there. And then, do we want to go right out to the edges of this site and just say, this is all wetland? Well, we don't really. It'd be nice to have a transition. We've got woodland next door at the SSSI. We've got a belt of woodland on our neighbour's land. Do we really want just like a cut off? Here's where our peatland is. Here's where the neighbouring woodland is. Well, not really. What we're going to do instead is allow it to transition naturally through scrub and heath into the woodlands. And that gives more opportunities for biodiversity if we do that as well. So this is what Coed-y-Sarnau looked like in summer 2021. We'd cleared the site in 2016 of all those conifers, done very little with it. Basically, we'd got a birch jungle, absolutely impenetrable. And in all honesty, at this point, we've got no idea what was actually going on in the middle of the site because it was just impossible to cut a way through there. Just a view from the other side, we can see some of the old forestry brash piled up there. But again, it's just birch as far as the eye can see. So the very first job we needed to do is clear off some of that scrub and see what was still going on there. So in winter 2021, 2022, we managed to get out there, clear several thousand young birch trees off it, and finally get a good look at what's been happening since the plantation was cleared. I've got to apologise, this picture has gone really pixelated. There's a few things on there. There's one or two birches we've missed. We were always going to with how many were on there. But interestingly, between the birches, there's a few other plants that have hung in there. There's a few tussocks of grass, some little bits of heather, and down towards the bottom, they're pretty hard to make out, are a few bilberries. So that was a nice surprise. It wasn't all just birch. There were other plants in there. And then actually, when we moved towards the middle of the site, things changed again. There'd been a lot less birch regeneration there. And we've got things like there's a few leggy little heathers there. The white you can see there is Cladonia reindeer moss. And that was just covering the whole area where it was driest. And then, not easy to see from my photos, but down in the ditches between these furrows, there were a few sphagnum in there as well, some of these bog mosses. So that was the good news. The plants that we were really interested in, some of them were still hanging on, even though we'd not done anything with the site since 2016. The next question is, where do we go from there? Well, the site was still dry. We knew that. We could see that the peat was drying out. And there weren't as many of the wetland plants as we would like. So what we need to do there is improve the water levels. We need to raise the water levels and wet up as much of that peat as possible. And also try to make sure that water's not leaving the site quickly. The ultimate goal there is to keep the ground wet or waterlogged all year round. And for a measure of that, we usually say the water table got to stay within 20 to 30 centimetres of the surface. Now, it's a very uneven surface, so that's not easy to do. But what we need to try and do is just bring the water levels up as much as possible. And there's two reasons for that. The first one is to encourage the wetland plants, but also discourage the trees. The theory is, if we get the water table high enough, birch saplings won't be able to thrive. But the other thing as well is the tops of those ridges, the peat's been exposed to the air and it's drying out. And as I said before, that's a problem because it's emitting carbon. The peat's not in a healthy condition where the sphagnum can recolonize and start creating new peat. So raising the water levels will try and prevent the peat drying out any further. So what we had to do is look at what was happening with the water. And this is what we sort of sketched up beforehand. Basically, we knew there was a big stream taking water to the southwest through the site and feeding into the wet woodland in the SSSI. And we knew there were some ditches, and we were generally assuming that water was flowing downhill from our neighbour's land, downhill from the road, and entering the stream. So what we need to do is identify where that water is flowing and try to block up the ditches and stop the water escaping. Well, that's easier said than done. The first thing we did is we had a couple of surveys done. We had somebody to make a drone map of it so we could get a surface model and try and work out exactly where the ditches were. And we also got a hydrologist involved. So again, look at where the water was flowing and the flow rates. And we ended up with something like this, which is a lot more complicated than we expected. And the more we looked at it, the more we realized we've got a problem. Well, most of the water's flooding out through the stream. But when we look at the wetland area, especially that main area to the south of the river, water is going every which way. That's not at all what we were banking on. We thought water was flooding in from next door, but actually it's going off to the southeast, off to the northwest. Some of it's going around the edge. Some of the drains don't actually meet that stream. They just run parallel to it for a bit. The more we considered this, the more we realized, well, actually, this isn't a flat slope. What we've got here is a little bit of a dome. And none of the water from our neighbour's land is actually going into that central wetland area. So what's going on? Well, actually, what we thought was a mire is a raised bog, and it's actually rain-fed. So the question isn't about how much water is going in. The big question is how much water is going out. But how are we going to block those ditches? This really, really simplifies it. There are so many ditches and grips and little places where water could be escaping. Tracking down every one of those ditches was going to be an absolute nightmare. And if we miss one, water's still going to be leaking somewhere. So we needed a new plan. So this is what we came up with. The bit in yellow is the exciting bit. What we decided to do is look at where water was going, look at where we can hold it up. And this is where some of our partners gave us some really critical advice. And they said, don't try and fix everything at once. The hydrology of wetland sites can be really complex. And if we think we've got it cracked and try to tie up every last bit of water, we can guarantee we'll miss something. So what the suggestion was, we focused on the worst area. And what we opted to do is to put in a continuous bund. So that's the yellow line. So that follows a line of topography. And the idea is that if we put a bund there, we will prop up the water table from that edge and slow down any water that's leaking off to the stream, pushing it back up onto the dome of the bog. And then if we need to, we can look in the future about whether we need to target additional dams where water might be particularly escaping from around the sides of the bund. And then other options, can we put dams in north of the stream? Could we put a sluice gate in? That's something we've seriously considered and we're still looking at. But that has problems of its own. We don't want to flood our neighbour's land by blocking the stream up. And equally, we don't want to starve water from the wet woodland. And the other thing we decided to do was put in a few ponds. And there's two reasons for that. One is it's a great habitat. There's not a lot of open water out here. And we thought we'd really boost biodiversity if we could put ponds in. But the other thing is, we were aware that the water coming into Cors-y-Sarnau from the neighbours' fields was looking very nutrient rich. It's pretty much improved grassland with grazing on it to the south. And pretty much every March, the water in the ditches goes a lovely shade of green as it fills up with algae. So we decided to put these ponds in to try and settle the water out and divert it before it hits the more sensitive areas and before the water hits that mainstream. So in February 2023, after a long time getting these plans in place, we finally started with some groundworks. So this is just a quick video of the guys installing the bund. And the way they do this is basically they dig down through the peat, taking off all the top layers where the peat's dry, crumbly, it's got cracks and roots in it, until they hit a layer where the peat is intact and impermeable and water can't flow through it. And that's usually about 1 metre down. What they do then is they take fresh peat from the upslope side, creating a little borrow pit, and use that to pack down and backfill the trench they've dug, and then build it up so it's about 20 centimetres above the surface of the bog. The reason it gets raised up above the surface of the bog is that bog surfaces will naturally rise and fall as they wet and dry out. And if you leave your dams too low or your bunds too low, there's a chance they'll quickly be overtopped if the surface of the bog starts to raise. And then the last thing that they do, which you can see the guy doing here, is they put the vegetation back on top what they've stripped off. And the reason to do that is to tie it all back together and protect that fresh peat they've put down, stop it drying out and stop it eroding. And these guys were phenomenal. They basically installed 500 meters of bund for us using these two specialized diggers over the course of 3 days. And at the same time, they dug 4 ponds for us. So that was carried out in February 2023. Here's just a couple of shots of the bunds after they went in. So the bund starts over there, sort of halfway up the left-hand side of the screen, and then continues across to the right above that bit of water. As you can see, they've disguised it really well by carefully putting the vegetation back on top of it. They even put the trees the right way up. That's how careful they were doing it. And the bit of water we're looking at there is one of the borrow pits they created where they extracted the peat. What is really good is the lack of disturbance. We had diggers on there for a few days, but they were very good at trying to avoid driving backwards and forwards and tracking through the peat and tearing it up. And then there's just another shot of the bund. You just step back and it just disappears because it blends in. But the bund basically starts around the middle of the screen and then swings around to the right. and then to the left of it is one of the new ponds that were built. If you go out there now, basically you're hard pressed to spot them now that the vegetation's growing back over them. And then the ponds. So the ponds were designed so that they've basically got a deeper area, about 1 meter deep, cut down into the peat, and then a shallow scrape along the edges. So the intention here is that all year round, they should have some water in the deep part, and then seasonally, as the water levels rise and fall, those scrapes will get flooded occasionally. And just as an indication of how much groundwater was refilling these ponds, this one here, this is a day after it had been built, and it's already filled in that lower part, the deeper part of the pond. And then this is the same pond 2 days later, and the water's already backfilling out through one of the drainage ditches as well. So it wasn't the intention when we built the ponds that they would have a massive effect on the water levels. But actually, incidentally, what they've done is they've started propping up the water table from the edges of the site as well. So in terms of the water levels, it's really critical for us to understand what is going on with the water now. Like I said before, we need to try and keep the water levels within about 30 centimetres of the surface all year round in the central wetland area. So we're currently monitoring that monthly. We've installed a series of dip wells. It's a little tricky to say right now how well the water levels are working. We've had some really tricky weather for trying to monitor wetlands this year. Basically, we installed this at the start of February and then had about 3 weeks where it was bone dry. And I think I must have been the only person in North Wales praying for rain because I was desperate to see how well this was going to work. And then we've had a year where we've had dry spells, wet spells. So the water levels are up and down. But we generally think the water levels have started to stabilise somewhere around that 30 centimetre mark or even closer to the surface across most of the area. One thing we do know is the bunds are working. This photo here is from a couple of weeks after some heavy rain, and you can see the water level in the pond is pretty much at the maximum, and that borrow pit behind the bund has filled up almost to the height of the bund. That's just how much water they're holding back that otherwise would have just flooded off over the surface or through the ditches. The other thing is the pond levels have been pretty good throughout the year. So even in the really hot, dry weather we've had, water has been kept in those deeper parts of the ponds, except for one. One of them's not doing as well as we thought, but the other 3 are working brilliantly. One of the unexpected effects we've had is that we appear to have accidentally propped up the water table outside of the bund as well. So some of the areas that we didn't think the bund would have an impact on have seen the water level rise and start to, again, approach that 30 centimetres that we're looking for. So in terms of carbon monitoring, this is, again, something that's ongoing. So Manchester Metropolitan University are coming down 2-3 times a year to look at carbon measurements. They use one of these cool little bubble chambers here that basically allows them to look at how carbon fluxes are happening throughout the respiration cycle of the plants. So what they do is they put that on there, this little dome that collects and analyzes the gases. They do it in full sunlight. They cover it up partly to see what the plant respiration and transpiration is like in partial shade, and then cover it up fully to try and see what will be happening at night. And the idea is that we expect to see emissions decrease. At the moment, the peatland is fairly dry, especially on the higher areas. So we're expecting it to be emitting carbon at the moment. And in time, we're hoping that that will come down, and eventually it will actually become a net carbon store, so that the peat is getting laid down and carbon is being locked up faster than the plant respiration is letting carbon into the air. It's currently far too early for us to tell, unfortunately, how this is going. We've only got a few data points, but we think we might be seeing the carbon emission rates starting to decrease on some of the driest areas. We've not seen a lot of change in the wetter areas, unfortunately, but hopefully things are moving in the right direction with that. And as we continue to monitor, we'll get a better idea of what's going on. And then the big question, have we managed to bring some colour back to the site? So if you can remember what it was like in 2014 and even in 2016, it was a fairly bleak area, very grey and green. Well, this is what it looks like now. What we've seen is, since the birch were cut down, we've seen a lot of heather springing up, a lot of bilberry coming through, a lot of grasses coming through. There's a few birches on there that are coming back, which is not what we want to see, but everything else is steps in the right direction. So at the moment, a lot of it looks quite like heathland, which is not ultimately where we want to be, but it's a step in the right direction. What we'd like to see is more of the wetland species dominating, and completely lost my thread of thought. So that's one of the things we're going to be keeping an eye on, just how much the heather's spreading. Do we need to trim back some of the heather and grasses and give other plants a chance? But hopefully, if we're right and we're starting to re-wet this, then that will also help move it towards a wetter flora. The really exciting thing is if we look in the wetter hollows, we see some amazing plants. So there's a whole range of bog mosses, the sphagnum on there. There's somewhere between about 10 and 13 species that we know of just on this side of Coed. In context, there's only 30 species of sphagnum recognised in the UK, so that is phenomenal. And there's all sorts of other plants. We've got cross-leaved heather, which is a good wetland indicator. That photo there, we've got bilberry. We've also got plants like cranberry coming through. And again, some of these wetter hollows where this photo here was actually taken in the middle of a heat wave. This isn't one of the drainage ditches, it's just a wet hollow, and you can see the sphagnum's doing its best to hold on to water even as the rest of the site's drying out. And I hope you'll agree with me that it's definitely a lot more colourful than the site was back in 2014. And some of the other plants that have cropped up, so cranberry, like I mentioned before, amazing little flowers on that. The cladonia, this reindeer moss, again, we might see that drop off a bit as the site wets up, but that is really widespread and a lovely plant to see. Lots of sphagnums, crowberry, purple moorgrass, again, which could be a bit problematic. And one of my favourites over there, cotton grass, and in particular, this is hare's tail cotton grass. We've seen an amazing amount of this start to come through this year. And that's a really good sign, because that's one of our best indicators that the ground is starting to stay wet year round. And I've got to mention the ponds as well. The ponds are amazing. So this pond here, this is one of the ponds that was created in February, and this is a photo of it in July. And you can see all that bare peat that we'd left at the edges of the pond has started to fill in with all these short rushes. And this was quite unexpected as well, because we didn't even know we'd got these short rushes anywhere nearby. They've just sprung out of nowhere. You might also be able to see there's a few sphagnum at the edges of the pond that are hanging in there, and we've tried to help that a little bit. We've had volunteers flinging handfuls of sphagnum into some of the ponds. And one of the other plants that we've got is bulrushes. We're trying to seed some of the ponds with bulrushes. So that's one of the jobs we did this year. We'll hopefully see them coming through next year, with the idea that they're one of the plants that will help mop up any nutrients that are going in there. But the really amazing thing about the ponds is the amount of invertebrates that they've sucked in. Within a week of them being there, the place was teeming. Damselflies, broad-bodied chasers. We've got all sorts of water beetles that have turned up, and even the frogs have had a brilliant year. They're everywhere now. So finally, what next? Where are we going? Well, the Care Peat project is coming to an end, but that's not the end of our restoration works at Cors-y-Sarnau. We need to keep on top of the scrub and grass. That's going to be an ongoing problem. One of the things we're looking at the moment is whether we get some grazing on there to help keep the grasses down. But we'll also probably have to do some manual work, trying to keep on top of those birch saplings and knocking back the heather. Do we need to do some more ditch blocking? That's a question I can't answer yet. We need to keep looking at those water levels. but there's probably scope for blocking 1 or 2 ditches in a targeted way. So rather than doing a bund, just trying to spot the ditches where most of the water's going, and putting a dam in there to help bring the water levels up. And can we extend the restoration area? That's another question that we're looking at, particularly the area north of the stream where we've not done anything yet. We're looking at options there. And finally, I've got to mention this because our volunteers have been working so hard on this. We're putting in some new paths on the reserve. So we've spent a good part of the year cutting through a new circular path, and we're hoping to be able to open that up. So we've got some nice views over this restoration area, because it'd be an absolute shame if we put all this effort into making this lovely wetland habitat and there's not a way for anybody to appreciate it. So watch this space, but we'll be putting some new paths in there. And that's it from me. So diolch yn fawr, and have you got any questions?
Thank you, Rich. That was, let me turn my camera off. I am still here. I haven't left. I just wanted to say, Rich, that was absolutely a fabulous talk. Like I said to you before, and I've not been to Cors-y-Sarnau, and I was looking forward to this. And you just literally explained everything so well and broken down what you've been trying to achieve and why you're doing it over the last couple of years. It's just been brilliant, and some of the contrasts in the pictures there of where it's come from and things like that are really good. And we have got a few questions in the chat, so I'll go through them now. But I just want to say thank you. It's been thoroughly enjoyable. You know, I work for the trust, and I didn't realize even the amount of work you guys were putting in and what's happening, things like that. You know, mainly because we do so much now, but it was just fascinating. So thank you. Really enjoyed that, as you can tell. Thoroughly enjoyed that talk. Well done. So a couple of questions I'll go through now, but one of the questions I was going to ask is, and you kind of led on to that at the end, was the path. So how accessible is it for people like myself or anyone else who wants to visit the site now? Because like you said,
this is the constant problem we have with Cors-y-Sarnau. Access is a nightmare. Basically, we have paths through the reserve. They are very uneven. So you do need a good pair of walking legs to get around. But the big problem we've got actually is there's not really anywhere to park. So we tend to park down in the village of Sarnau and then hike up the main road, which can be, I'll say, a little bit hairy at times, as you've got lorries barreling past you. So one of the things we're looking at is whether we can do anything to improve access, but that is going to be some way in the future. It's a little bit complicated, I'll say, to see if we can do anything about that. But we've got a few ideas we're bouncing around.
But yeah, but if you wanted to go down and have a walk around, that you could get there, with a bit.
You can, yeah. There's a couple of entrances to the reserve, so you can just park up in either of the villages, walk through. Basically, at the moment, the path takes you from one end to the other of the original reserve. We have got the new circular path, so you can loop through the new deciduous woodland and back through the wet woodland. It's just not on any of our maps, and we haven't got way markers on it. But that's there if there's any adventurous spirits who want to give it a crack. And then in the future, we're hoping to open up a little viewpoint above the bog. And then further down the line, we've got ideas about boardwalks, and can we walk people out onto the Bunds so we can get a closer look at it.
Oh, that'd be fabulous. I think obviously you've got a problem with sticking boardwalks and when the water level's changing a bit as well, haven't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember because I work up at Kinbrenny quite a lot, and I go to my Coed nature reserve. And there's a bird hide there, which is on the far side of the Welsh Water Visitor Centre, which is well used. And I was once told there was a boardwalk up there, and I went to find it, and it was literally 30 centimeters underwater because the water level had changed, so it's gone completely. Well, Rihanna
I will say as well on that as well, it's definitely not a site you want to go off piste on, because I have been so deep into boggy puddles and peatland. And yeah, don't go wandering off the paths on your own.
So on that note, one of the things Rihanna was asking, how many volunteers do you have helping you currently up there? Because obviously you mentioned the volunteers have been helping with putting stuff in the ponds and the paths and things like that.
That's right, yeah. One of the things I've been doing, I work closely with Jordan, who's one of our reserve officers over in the northeast. We've got a regular volunteer session. Cors-y-Sarnau, to be honest, been a little bit neglected on the volunteer front for many years. It's difficult for a lot of people to get to. So what we've done is we've got it now, so we do it once a month. We've got a Friday set aside where the volunteers know we're off to Cors-y-Sarnau. So we've got sort of 4 or 5 regulars come down every month.
Fantastic. And if anyone else wants to get involved or would like to help out on any of our sites, just pop onto the website, click on the volunteering bit. You can get added to the volunteering list. We'll let you know what you're doing. No experience necessary. There's something for everyone in there. And no obligation from yourselves to come in. So if you do want to help out, you're more than welcome. We'd love the support. Another question's coming from Joanna. She's asked how the neighbouring landowners have reacted to the work you've been doing.
The neighbouring landowners have been really positive, actually. That's been brilliant. So the farmer to the south is actually our grazier. So he put some stock on the SSSI to keep the grass levels down there. So we have a really good relationship with him. And the land to the north, which is the bit we're a little bit dubious about whether we're going to flood it if we do too much. We know that landowner really well, and she's very supportive of what we're doing. They manage that little meadow next to us in a very sympathetic way. It's an amazing little meadow, lots of wetland plants, and they have a very light touch on it. So they're keen to see what we're doing. So we've kept them in the loop of what we're doing, invite them down, and basically, yeah, just talk them through what we're doing and get them on board.
And does it seem to be working so far?
It does, yeah. We'd love to have a few more contacts in the community. I don't think it's a reserve that gets a lot of footfall, in all honesty, even from the locals. So that would be one of our true ambitions for Cors-y-Sarnau, is to get everybody who's living in the villages nearby involved, but slow progress.
Yeah, it's also in a very rural location as well, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Out in the sticks. So I think that's it. I don't think I've got any more questions. I was just really interested. Oh, there is another one I'll ask in a second. So I was just really enjoyed the contrast in a couple of years. So, you know, when you started the work and the pictures were there, that I just thoroughly enjoyed watching that and seeing how it progressed. Because I joined the trust 5 years ago. One of the first things that happened to me when I joined is I was going around different reserves and different places, seeing what was going on. And they just dug a couple of ponds on our Aberdeen Nature Reserve. And they were literally just scrapes out in an area that had just been grazed previously. And I remember thinking, what's going to go on with them? And I remember just watching them over the coming years. And every time I go up, there's more and more animals there. There's more insects there. They just come back alive. And it was interesting that you said it as part of the thinking process at the start was just leave it for a little bit and see what it does. Let's not try and fix it all. Just leave it a bit, and like you leave in those areas to actually just see what happened and see what came back naturally. And it will, wasn't it? Things just regenerate.
Yeah. And that's something we've really had to think about all the time, because there was a plan originally to basically strip every last bit of birch off that side of the reserve. We didn't do it in 2021, mostly because our contractors who we were using to do most of the work maybe underestimated how many trees were there and how long it'd take them. So there are a few bits that didn't get touched. And then, so we were like, oh, well, we need to crack on with them, get that cleared off. And the more that myself and Jordan looked at it, well, actually, you know, that's really nice. We've got a little belt of trees connecting from the woodland next door to the river. Do we want to lose that for the sake of saying we've got another 0.2 of a hectare of peatland? And the more we thought about it, we thought, well, actually, no, yeah, we want to preserve the peatland, but we also want to encourage biodiversity, and having those little bits of wood, those little transitions of scrub, they're all going to add up and create more habitat for more species.
Yeah. Oh, brilliant. No, thanks. Dave in the chat's now asking, what animals could you introduce for the conservation grazing?
That is a really good question. So at the bottom end of the reserve, it's a mixture of sheep and cattle that are used at the moment. And in all said and done, it's a little bit hit and miss. The sheep don't like going on the bog. The cattle are really hesitant to go on there sometimes. So bad last year that they went back over the fence to next door rather than stay on our land. But the cattle is one option we're looking at. At the moment, what's pulling ahead is possibly Carnarvon pony. We've been using them at Cors-y-Sarnau for similar sort of landscape. And at first, there was a bit of a concern about how they get on with the bog, but they're okay, actually. They get in there, they get themselves out. So that concern's not there. So we're seriously considering Carnarvon for it. The other one that I've got in mind is alpacas, because one of the landowners across the road's got alpacas, and partly because they're just so cute. How could you not want them on your reserve? It turns out actually alpacas are naturally a wetland species in Argentina on the Plano. So I don't know. Has anybody ever looked at alpacas for conservation grazing? I'd love to give it a try.
Yeah, something to look for. Yeah, definitely. I'm glad you've mentioned Cors-y-Sarnau and the Carnedis, because I'm in looking through the names of the attendees. There's a few people from our Conway Valley branch who know that reserve very, very, very well, and you've seen the work the Carnedis are doing up there and what that's doing, and you know, there's an area of that which is wetland as well, isn't there? So there's a lot of similarities up there. So no, thanks for that. Rihanna in the chat there says thank you for the talk. Really, really interesting. Really enjoyed it. And Joanna said, thanks very much. Hope the work here informs more peatland restoration work on coniferized sites. And Mark Sheridan is in the chat as part of the Conway Valley branch, says, great talk, learned so much, excellent work, and we look forward to a new path so we can explore the reserve and particularly view the new ponds. Thank you very much, Richard.
Yep. So, cheers, everyone.
No, it's been a really enjoyable talk, mate. Like I said, I've recorded this. I will put it up on YouTube in the future for anyone else, and I think it's just been really informative. And the people I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and looks like the people in the chat have enjoyed it. And usually, a good indicator is how many people we have lost throughout the talk. And I don't think we've lost any. So, well done, mate. All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.
I will send the YouTube link, Malcolm, when it's done. Don't worry. I'll send it to all the people from the talk, and we'll make sure it goes on social media. All right. Take care. Bye.